So today I'm going to give you a crash course on plant identification. And one of the keys to plant identification is flowers. You might say, why are you showing me these things? These aren't flowers. Actually, these are flowers. This is a mulberry flower. In fact, this is actually a male mulberry flower. This is an oak flower. And this, although technically it hasn't actually started blooming yet, these are grass flower buds. So all of these things, even things that you may not recognize as being pretty, most of the plants we're exposed to are flowering plants. Pretty much every tree, except for some of the pine trees. The food you eat, except for pine nuts, I guess, or fern fiddleheads. Everybody eats fern fiddleheads, right? No. So almost everything that we eat, everything that we grow, is pretty much a flowering plant. Angiosperms. So these are angiosperms too. Of course, we'll look at some pretty flowers in just a bit. So this is a dichotomous key. Di means two, chotomy means to choose. So this is kind of the workhorse of pretty much any kind of identification, not even just plant identification. This is kind of the standard, and it has been the standard for a very long time. You might say, well, we have the internet, we don't really need these. Yes and no. I mean, the internet and some of the apps that we have can get you a general idea, but a lot of times when you're getting down to a very specific species, you're still going to need this. And the other thing is this can help you to start to recognize, the key will actually help you recognize families. So you'll start to recognize patterns in the families. And that's actually what I teach in my plant taxonomy class, is basically recognizing families on site rather than just using a key like this. So when you use a dichotomous key, there's always two choices. So here we've got, you'll start with the one in the most left, it'll start at the top. So you've got perianth, it's petals and sepals, in threes, leaves mostly parallel veins. So basically it's saying, is it a monocot, which is a group of flowering plants, or we have this other option down here, petals or tepals, mostly net vein, vascular bundles of the stem in a ring, cotyledons too, eudicots and magnoliids. Now the other part of this is each of these will have what they call a lead, and then this will tell you where to go next. So this one, if I choose this one, it says, okay, it says 6, so I now have two things on 6 to choose from. So I have what appears to be a single flower, is actually many florets. Now I've got an actual answer. So if it has this, we say, okay, that's the sunflower family. If the flowers are not as above, then I have to keep going. Now I'm going to go to, it tells me to go to 7. So I'm going to look for my 2 7s to choose from. So flowers imperfect, plants monoecious or dioecious, or flowers perfect. Say, what does that mean? So this is the part that can be difficult. You say there's all these different terms. What do any of these mean? And that's actually what the rest of the video is going to show you. I'm going to walk you through what each of these actually means. We'll look at some flowers, we'll look at the parts, we'll look at the terminology, so that you have some clue as to how to use a key like this. This is a typical flower. And so this green thing right in here, this is the ovary, this is the style, and this end right here is the stigma. That's the female part. So the female part is the part that makes the seeds right here. These yellow things right here, those are each the stamen. So this, we can tell it's a monocot because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, well, petals. Technically speaking, these are tepals. So 3 of these are actually sepals. I think 1, 2, 3, these ones on the outside, and then 1, 2, 3 are petals. But we call them tepals because they all look alike. And on this one, you can kind of tell this is a compound pistil, because if you look really carefully, you can actually see a little seam. And basically what that means, the ovary is actually made of leaves that have ovules on them that will become seeds. And those get fused together during development. And I'll actually cut this guy open so hopefully you guys can see on the inside. So this is a close-up of the ovary. And you can see here, we've got ovules in here. These openings right here, these are the locules. Then right here we've got, this is actually a carpel. So this is an individual carpel that's been fused together. So you can tell we've got 1, 2, 3 carpels. So here I've got it labeled. You can almost see the seam between the carpels on this one. So you can kind of see these are lined up. These are ovules. Of course, these two, these two, these two, these are all ovules. They will turn into seeds, or at least they would have, had I not chopped the plant up. This opening right here, this is called a locule. And if this looks kind of familiar, you say, gee, this looks a little bit like a tomato or a pepper that I've cut open. That's because tomatoes and peppers, being fruits, are mature ovaries, and a lot of ovaries look fairly similar. So here, these ovules, the ends that are actually attached to the mother plant, are right here. These are what we call the placentae. They're not really obvious in this plant, but this is a type of placentation called axile placentation. All right, so this is an example of a dicot. So this is an example of a Eudicot flower. So right here, we've got Eudicots have their flower parts in 4s and 5s, so we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. Then we've got these nice, beautiful stamens here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stamens. And again, we've got filaments, and then we've got anthers. So this is the ovary down here. It's this big kind of greenish thing. Now this one's a little different. All these little filaments right here are actually separate stigmas coming out. So this particular Syncarpous ovary has lots of stigmas coming out instead of one, because they're not all fused together. So this group right down here, that's actually the ovary there. Now this one, it's actually got separate sepals. So now I can flip it over. So flipped over, we can still see the 5 petals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can still see 5 petals. And now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sepals. Again, this is the peduncle right here. And that's going to attach that flower to the stem. So this is one of the ways you can tell that it's a Eudicot, because of those parts being in 5s. This is actually the flower of a sundew that I've been growing inside the house. This is a close-up of the Eudicot flower that we were just looking at, and this, each of these little kind of cylindrical things right here, each of these is actually an ovule. So these, if you can kind of tell, it's hard to tell, but these, the placentae, are attached towards the outer edge of the ovary. So this is what we call parietal placentation. So it's got a huge number of them. It looks like there are probably 3 carpels. So there's 1, 2, 3. But there's basically just one locule, because basically they've fused edge on rather than fusing and then fusing again. So notice these little orange dots right here. Those are actually pollen grains. So this is your ovary. Here are the ovules right here. So each of these would become a seed. And of course, this whole thing, when it matures, becomes a fruit. Now, not necessarily a tasty, fleshy fruit, but a fruit. Anyway, this is a wild strawberry. So it's relatively small compared to the strawberry plants that would produce your store-bought strawberries. But it should serve our purposes. So we can tell that this is another Eudicot. So we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now this one, this is kind of the more primitive characteristics where the flowers have relatively larger number of parts. Now in this one, it's got the typical Eudicot number of petals. So it's got 5 petals. And then if we flip it over, it's probably got, now part of this may be part of a hypanthium, which we'll talk about later. And then there's 1, 2, 3. And there's, for some reason there's 9. I guess we lost one there. But anyway, what's important about this one is instead of having one pistil, which is kind of makes a little bit more sense, it actually has lots of pistils. And this is what makes these guys confusing. So this is what we call Apocarpous. Apocarpous means that the the carpels are not fused. So most of the plants we're more familiar with are syncarpous, meaning the pistils, the carpels are fused together. So here's a close-up of the strawberry flower under the dissecting scope. So we've got here, this is the stigma, this is a style, stigma, style. And these little round things right here, they may look a little familiar to you. They may look a little bit like strawberry, quote, seeds. Those aren't actually seeds. Those are the true fruits of the strawberry. So these right here, each of these is a separate ovary, a stigma, and a style. So you've got all these separate carpels. So these are apocarpous, meaning that they're not fused. And what a strawberry fruit is actually the receptacle. There's a structure under this that these are all sitting on. That enlarges and becomes red and fleshy. These become actual hard structures called the keens, which are more like sunflower seeds. So anyway, stigma, style, ovary. So there's one there. And these are the stamens out here. These big white things, these are the petals. These big white things are the petals. And these green things right here between the petals, those are actually the sepals. So kind of a different flower, Apocarpous flower. These would still be a superior ovary because they're attached above everything else. Alright, so what we have right here is one more permutation of this whole thing. This is called a Sympetalous or Sympetalous flower. And that means that this flower, actually all these petals, even though you can count 5, they're actually all fused together. So if you notice on the side here, it's purple. Here's this purple tube. What's on the back here, the sepals are way down there. So these little green things, these are the sepals right there. So you say, where's the stigma and the style and the stamens? Well, they're actually all inside of this tube. So a flower like this, a lot of times they're pollinated by something with a really long tongue. So I'm going to open this up. So I ripped it in half, and you can see those tiny little yellow dots in there. Those are actually the stamens. The stigma is going to be farther down. So I'll have to switch to the dissecting scope for that. So this one, this is a cross-section through the Phlox flower. So we had that fused floral tube, so this is all a bunch of petals. This purple stuff is the petals fused together. This orange right here, orange or kind of yellowish, these are actually the stamens that are inside of this tube. And they're fused, they're all fused together with the petals. So the stamens and the petals are fused. A pollinator would actually, something like a butterfly or a moth, would stick its tubular tongue down here and basically pick up a little bit of pollen. If you notice, this is the ovary down here. You can kind of see the seams a little bit. Here's the stigma. Here's the style. These are the sepals. They're super long. These little things right here, these are actually hairs called trichomes. So this is still actually a superior ovary because if we look at the sepals, even though they're really tall, they're attached below the ovary. Alright, so this one, this is a plum flower. So it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. It's got a lot of stamens, so notice they've got these really long filaments. And these are the anthers on the end. Now what's interesting about this one is this has something that is special that's generally found in the rose family. So if you look here in the center, it has something called a hypanthium. And basically what that is it's a little cup that the ovary sits in. The whole pistil actually sits in this little cup. So I'll have to cut it. Hopefully you guys will be able to see it. This structure right here is a fusion of the sepals, the petals, and the stamens. So it's called the hypanthium. So notice it's not fused. This is the ovary right here. This is the style going up. So it's not fused. So this is what we call hypanthium. So botanically speaking, this is very common in the rose family. So this is actually still a superior ovary because all of this is attached down here. Now if this were all fused on top of the ovary, that would make it an inferior ovary. But this one right here is a superior ovary. But it is what we call perigynous, meaning peri, meaning going around, because the hypanthium goes around the ovary, but isn't actually attached to it. All right, now one of the last permutations we can throw at you is, or at least, well, not really, but one of them. This is the Zygomorphic or irregular flower. So meaning that the flower, these flowers have bilateral symmetry instead of radial symmetry. Every flower we've looked at so far has had radial symmetry. And kind of when people draw generic flowers, that's usually what they draw. But certain groups of plants, and this is usually one of their identifying characteristics, is they will have bilateral symmetry. So notice this one has actually got two lips. So it's got a bottom lip and a top lip. And the bottom lip doesn't look like the top lip. And that means the left side looks like the right side, but the top doesn't look exactly like the bottom. That's a characteristic of bilateral symmetry. So you can see it on these guys. And you can see, if you look really carefully, there's a really small one. Those little yellow dots, those are the stamens inside of this little thing. This is actually a member of the mint family. It's a weedy plant. It's called Lamium Plexicaulis. And it's actually got a square stem that's identifying for the mint family. So the mint family will almost always have this bilateral symmetry, and then it'll also have that square stem. So this is also a Sympetalous flower. As you can tell, the tube is made of petals. The whole tube is made of petals. So that's one big fused group of petals. Counting the petals on this can be a little bit difficult. Sometimes you kind of have to guess based on kind of the bumps at the end. I believe this one is actually supposed to have 5, but it's a little bit harder to tell. So the thing to remember is you can also get bilateral symmetry in an Apopetalous flower. This is actually the flower of Redbud, one of the members of the Fabaceae or bean family, and they have this very specialized structure. Usually those two bottom petals are fused together to form something called a keel. This one it's not fused, but we've got 2 petals on the top that are separate, and then we've got 2 petals on the bottom. So we have 5 petals, but the 5 petals are not in a radial symmetry, so this is bilateral symmetry instead. So again, if we open this, in the back, these are the sepals. Oops, I just accidentally knocked a petal off. Those are the sepals back there. Looks like they're fused together. When you talk about the sepals collectively, that's the calyx. When you talk about all of the petals, you talk about the corolla. Because especially when they're Sympetalous, it's kind of talking about individual petals can be somewhat difficult. Okay, so this is the Redbud flower. So I've ripped off some of the stamens. So notice here's the filament. There's the anther. So the anther is what's going to release the pollen. This is a filament that's lost its anther. So we've got anther, 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 anther. Then right here, this kind of green thing, this is the pistil. And this is kind of the simplest pistil, which is one carpel, and it's basically just like it's a leaf that's folded over. So down here is the ovary, the part that's green. This is a member of the bean family, so it will actually look kind of like a pea pod once it's matured. This is the style, and then this end right here, that's the stigma. So the pollen grains have to land on the stigma for it to be pollinated. And here's a little bit more of a close-up. You can actually kind of see the individual pollen grains here. There's one, there's another one, there's another one. They're really small. But right here, this is the stigma. Looks like some pollen grains landed on this one. These are the anthers. These are the filaments. So that's just a close-up at the end. All right. So oaks have imperfect flowers. And when we say imperfect, oaks have imperfect flowers. When we say imperfect, we mean that they're missing one of the 2 sexes. So a perfect flower has both stamens and pistils. but an imperfect flower will have only one or the other. So this is called a catkin. This is a male flower. In fact, it's actually a male inflorescence. Each of these little things is actually a single male flower. So like this one would be one male flower. This is another one. And they'll release pollen. One of the reasons they don't have pretty petals is this is a wind-pollinated flower. So this will kind of blow around in the wind. And then hopefully it lands on one of these, which these tiny little things right here, those are actually the female flowers. And those little tiny hair-like things right there, those are actually the stigmas of the female flowers. So eventually, these will actually grow out into acorns, because of course this is an oak tree, and that's the kind of fruits that it actually produces. So this is monoecious, and that means that it has both male and female together. So one tree is bisexual. It's both male and female. But we'll see a few trees are actually either male or female. So they'll produce either all male flowers or all female flowers. All right, so right here, you may say, well, why are you showing me a bean pod? This is a representative of a dioecious species, meaning it has separate male and female individuals. So this tree right here, this is scientific name Gymnoclitus dioecious, or dioecious. This is a Kentucky coffee tree. And people used to use these seed pods for coffee, which I don't recommend. You have to roast them or they're toxic. Which I just ripped this one open, so if you can see this, looks like, if it may look like a bean pod to you, that's because it is. It's in the Fabaceae. But only females, and this is true of all dioecious species, only females produce fruit, because they only produce the female flowers, and the female flower parts are the ovaries, and that's what actually produces fruit and seeds. So if you have a dioecious species like this, and you want to have seeds, you got to have at least one male in the area at least, and one female. So this one right up here, this is actually a female. So this is a female Kentucky coffee tree.